Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Bulelwa Payi. I'm a journalist, but I also identified myself as a social justice activist. So when the invite came through to join these two authors to talk about the history and the present day things that are happening, that are shaping our country, I kind of like, oh wow, this is an opportunity just to delve into the minds of not only those politicians, but also of the people that are brave enough to go out there and collect all these information for us so that we can unpack and understand exactly why we are in the situation that we are in today. So a very warm welcome to you guys, because I can see, I now understand that it is not only journalists who are worried about what is going on, but everybody, the citizens as well. And I hope that this session will be as engaging as we all want to unpack exactly what is going on in the country. And we are curious to know. I suppose there are not claim Santas who map out the scenarios, but we can always glean from the past and the present into where we are going. So today, I'm so glad that we are joined by these two distinguished authors so that we can then talk about these issues. I'm always not so good. Immediate left is Jacques Pauw. He is a journalist, and he's written quite many books. I will just name but a few. The President's Keepers, which came before this one that we will be talking about today, and also the present one, Our Poisoned Land, Living in the Shadows of Zuma's Keepers. And on the side, we have Pieter du Toit, who's also a journalist and an assistant editor of investigations at News 24. He's also written books. One is The Enemy of the People, how Jacob Zuma stole South Africa and how the people fought back. And that book he co-wrote with his colleague. And then there was the Stellenbosch Mafia. And today we are discussing his latest book, The ANC Billionaires, Big Capital's Gambit and the Rise of the Few. To kick off, I'll just cut to the chase. As South Africans, we've got this fascination about Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma is the kind of individual that we are all worried about. And I see that in the ANC Billionaires, you talk about some other ANC leaders that came to the fore as well. And also, but in your book, Jacques, you focus more on what came after you wrote The President's Keepers. And that was that Jacob Zuma seems to be the person that we should be focusing on and to trace everything that has been happening in the country back to the Zuma era. Maybe to kickstart and to understand the context of both books. Maybe we should start with Pieter du Toit, because yours, you take us back to when the ANC was in exile and when a group of business people went to Lusaka and met with the ANC. I suppose there were so many agendas for that trip, but just to put everything into context, can you touch on that visit?
Bulelwa, thanks, and good morning, everyone. the context for the book certainly is on the back of the previous book that I did that was titled The Stellenbosch Mafia,
Yes.
which was conceived during the high point of the Bell Pottinger era, during which the propaganda machinery around the Zuma and Gupta networks tried to draw attention away from grand state capture, from grand corruption, as we saw it reaching its absolute zenith in around 2016, 2017. And an easy target was so-called white monopoly capital, the so-called Stellenbosch Mafia. And as part of the research of that, for that book, rather, I had to go back to see where so-called Afrikaner capital came from, and how it was a nationalist project after the Anglo-Boer War, the 1930s, the poor white problem, 1948, and thereon up until to present day, where you have Stellenbosch as the seat for a number of well-heeled and well-established businessmen and their businesses. The flip side of that coin was to go and see how the new members of the economic ruling class, black members of the economic ruling class, came to be where they are today, and those roots lie, for me, and I argue it in the book, lie in the mid-1980s when big capital, so-called big capital, saw that they had to interfere in the political process that in the mid-1980s reached an impasse and a stalemate. And I think the relevance for today is we're again in a situation where I think big capital, big business, people with influence need to wield that influence to try and ensure that we see institutional and political change, because we are in a situation in this country where it seems that we are struggling to get out of a long and a dark hole, an economy that is really struggling, weak political leadership, institutions that are, many of them have so been hollowed out during the Zuma years in which Jacques wrote about. But we do have the institutional, the economic, the intellectual capacity in this country to get ourselves out of this hole. And if we could do it in the 1980s and in the 1990s, I think we can do so again.
All right. One gets a sense when we read the book, The ANC Billionaires, that during that trip by big business, by big capital to Lusaka, they got a sense that the ANC had no economic policy in place at all. Actually, they were so fixated on the Freedom Charter, which did not then spell out what they will do once they get into power.
Yes, what was fascinating for me, look, where we are now as a country is we are being governed by a governing party or a government at the moment that does not seem to know how to compete in a globalized, rapidly changing and dynamic environment, dynamic economy, a global economy. We've got an economy where unemployment is, on the broader definition, almost at 46%. We've got an enormous deficit on the budget. Every single metric, economic metric, shows that we are headed in the wrong direction. And it's not as if we weren't warned about where we are now, where we might be headed. And I think the genesis of the frustration that we've got now with our government, with the lack of creative economic policies, with a lack of creative political policies, socio-political policies, lie in the fact that the ANC in the 1980s were woefully underprepared to take over a modern industrial economy on the southern tip of Africa. Even though it was an apartheid capitalist society, they were underprepared. And in interviews for the book with people like Trevor Manuel and Jay Naidu, who were on the liberation movement side, but also individuals in the Anglo-American sphere like Michael Spicer, who unfortunately died last year, it was very clear that the ANC did not have any plan for what would happen when they eventually would have taken over the country. On the flip side, Jay Naidu, the UDF people inside of the country, had very clear ideas of what they wanted to do with the economy. So there were plans. It's just not that they weren't the ANC plans. So the ANC were woefully underprepared. I think between 96 and 2006, we had a very good decade in this country as far as economic and general policy issues are concerned. But again, you mentioned Jacob Zuma earlier, and Jacques writes about Zuma in his book. Once Polokwane happened, once Polokwane came, things changed, and we haven't been able to row it back since December 2007. So I think the ANC's lack of insight into how to govern a complicated country in the early 1990s was offset by that decade, 96 to 2006, when Trevor Manuel, Thabo Mbeki really did go out of their way to try and ensure that they can establish and run a modern economy. But Zuma, the nationalist politics of the ANC, the tribalist politics of the ANC, the patrimonial type politics that they espouse, the corruption, I think that's probably always been prevalent in the ANC. It's just now come to the fore again, and we are now paying the price for that.
Okay. Can I come to you, Jacques? So with this, Our Poisoned Land, which is a sequel to your President's Keepers, where you outlined the people that were keeping Zuma in position and the corruption that took place at that time. So with this one, you kind of delve into the whole environment that then enabled for that corruption to take place, and why, even after Zuma is long gone from that political seat, high political seat, we still see we are grappling with the problems. Just take us back to that.
Yeah, I mean, we in many ways, we're in a worse state now than we were at the end of 2017, when it was the last days of the Zuma presidency. You know, I published that book in November last year. It's already outdated. I mean, there's so many things that have happened.
Yeah.
You know, about a month ago, Statistics South Africa, which is a government institution, released the economic figures for the first quarter of 2023. They measure the economy in every quarter. And they said that the South African economy between the 1st of January and the end of March this year had shrunk by 1.3%. Amongst others because of load shedding. And it then said that the economy now is only 0.3% bigger than it was in January 2020, just before COVID broke out. But that the population, in the meantime, between the beginning of 2020 up to now, had increased by 3.5%. It is an absolutely frightening figure, because we know what that means. It means more poverty, more unemployment, ultimately more crime. You know, in 2017, or at the end of 2017, during the last year of Zuma's presidency, 19,000 people were killed in this country. At the moment, it's 28,000. We are far, in many ways, we are far worse than we were 5 years ago. But I think even more important than that is we had such hope in February 2018 when Ramaphosa became the president.
A new dawn.
It was a new dawn. I mean, and I think we were so elated to be that we got rid of Jacob Zuma that we overlook the shortcomings that Ramaphosa already showed in the first year of his presidency. He did many things right. I mean, new heads for the law enforcement agencies, you know, his whole investment ambassadors he appointed. But, you know, he did say when he became president that he will halve the serious crime rate within 10 years if he gets a second term. Remember the promises he made about unemployment, the promises he made about fixing the economy. Well, it's gone. It's not going to happen. And you know, I'm not a carrier of particularly good news, because I think if something drastic doesn't happen very, very soon, we will, for example, become a mafia state. You know, there's no time to talk, and nothing gets done. You know, when the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime released their report in September last year, they measure organized crime around the world. South Africa is now the country in the world with the 18th most organized crime. Yes. It's busy overtaking us. And I fear that if the ANC wins the election again next year with an outright majority, we're going to be in very serious trouble. because I don't think anything is going to change.
You talk about crime, and you talk a lot about that and the hollowing out of key security agencies like the South African Police, the Hawks, the Social Security SSA.
Yeah.
I'm so whatever, and the NPA as well. For the benefit of everyone, can you just map out how that happened and why it is so significant for the situation that we are now in?
Well, we all know that Jacob Zuma hollowed out the law enforcement agencies because he had to protect himself and his cronies. He had to make sure that there's no consequences for the state looters, for the people that engineered state capture. And therefore, he hollowed out the law enforcement agencies. And they've never really recovered. What Ramaphosa did is he appointed new heads. You know, there was a new head of the Hawks, a new head of the NPA, new head of the State Security Agency. But it doesn't help that you just replace the head. You talk about that second and third and fourth layers of command are very much still the same people. You know, our head of organized crime, which is arguably, you know, one of the biggest problems we have, our head of organized crime is a major general that comes from the state capture era, who had to make dockets disappear during the state capture era. General Alfred Kana, I mentioned his, and I wish he wants to sue me, but anyway. He's the head of organized crime of the Hawks. He's a palooka. I mean, he's useless. I mean, we're never going to win the war against organized crime if we continue like this. It doesn't help to appoint 10,000 new policemen. It's not going to make a difference. You know, we have a minister of police who was found to have probably been implicated in criminality by the previous public protector, not the one we have at the moment, Thuli Madonsela. He was implicated in probable criminality when he was commissioner of police. Remember, he was Jacob Zuma's first commissioner of police, and Zuma had to fire him. He had to go. And then he made a comeback, and now he's the minister of police. He has no moral authority to be the minister of police. All he does is to go from one shooting incident to the next and promises everyone that there's going to be arrest and they're going to find the killers and whatever. You know, so I think, and that's why I say I think we're in such serious trouble. Ramaphosa had the opportunity after winning a second term at the ANC elective conference in December. He had an opportunity to reshuffle his cabinet. Yes, and he got rid of Lindiwe Sisulu, but why is Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma still sitting there? You know, the appeal court has found that her decision to ban smoking during COVID was illegal. She should have been fired. Becky Kele should have been fired. Gwedi Montashe should have been fired. I mean, they're all still there. And I'm afraid if the ANC wins the election, they're still going to be there next year as well.
And when we talk about crime, organized crime and crime in general, one of the biggest issues people have had, and people within SAPS as well, who were trying to fight crime. I mean, in the Western Cape and in Cape Town in particular, we have seen a rise in crime, in organized crime. There's now not only about drugs and stuff, there's the hijackings, there's the syndicates that run
the building
in
mafia,
the township, the construction mafia, and you know, that are involved in the extortions and all that.
Yeah.
But then when you look at it and when you speak to people in the SAPS, they will always tell you it's because the ANC leadership or the ministers of police who came from the ANC had put in power some policemen who were part of the apartheid system and who were in the homelands. So there's always been that friction for power within SAPS, how has it affected the ordinary person, in your view?
Well, I mean, it's just so when you look at the appointments in the police. Now, when Ramaphosa became president in February 2018, the Commissioner of Police was Kehla Sitole, who had been appointed by Jacob Zuma during his last days in power. Now, there's a very good reason why Zuma appointed Sitole, because Sitole is useless. He's a homeland policeman. He comes from the Kwandebele Homeland Police. He only has a matric. He doesn't have any other qualifications. And this is in many ways South Africa's top civil servant. I mean, this is he runs the department with 100,000 employees. It's massive. And here comes Kehla Sitole, homeland policeman. During the first days of his commissionership, he becomes embroiled in a criminal scheme to get money to the RET faction of the ANC with the 2017 elective conference. Ramaphosa kept him on for 4 years. He had all the ammunition he needed to fire Sitole. Now, you know that when you're a shitty manager, you're going to appoint shitty people under you. I mean, it is as simple as that. You're not going to appoint people who's going to show you up. You're going to appoint people who are more or less on your level of competency. And that's exactly what Sitole did. And here we sit today. And as I said, the government completely failed to clean up the law enforcement agencies. They appointed a new head like Godfrey Lebea at the Hawks is completely useless as well. He can't make decisions. I don't know whether you saw when he last reported back about the state of the Hawks, he had some funny university kind of robe on or something. Anyway, so the state of the police, I mean, there's a police general sitting there who was fired by Sitole because of a Facebook. And I mean, Jeremy Veery is one of the best policemen we had. He was fired because of a Facebook post. And there's just so many examples of, for example, how the police failed to protect Colonel Kinnear, who was gunned down, yes. 3 years ago. They completely failed to protect him. In fact, everybody knew there was a threat against Kinnear, except Kinnear himself. Lebea knew about it. The head of the Hawks in Gauteng knew about it, and he came down the ladder. Everybody forgot to warn Kinnear that his life is in danger. So it's just one big mess. And unfortunately, we see it in the crime rate. I mean, I think, for example, that the Security and Intelligence Division of Fidelity Security is far better than the Hawks. Far better. I mean, they probably have much better officers and policemen. The Hawks can't do a forensic investigation anymore. They've lost that expertise. So how do you fight organized crime when you can't do a forensic investigation?
Let's come to you, Pieter.
He's got better news than I do.
So we get the ANC back with Thabo Mbeki and the others. All the exiles can return to the country. It's Kumbaya for the first few years, if we can put it that way. But then you suggest as well that here comes this group of people who have lost touch of what is happening in the country. And all that they are fixated on is political power, and they forget about the economics of the country, because you can't run the country without growing its economy. And they were just kind of like in the dark, and they were holding on to socialism. And the way you frame it, it was, I think, in the words of Spicer, who said, or one of the delegates, who said, well, they went there and they forgot that there's quite a lot happening around the globe as well. So those events were going to have an effect in South Africa as well. Can you touch on that just a little bit?
Bulelwa, yes. By the end of the 1980s, the world was changing very quickly and very rapidly. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 obviously precipitated former President de Klerk's decision to release Nelson Mandela and unban political parties in 1990. But the world was changing very rapidly. The Soviet Union fell in December 1991. So the environment in which the ANC believed that they were returning to was completely different to what they wanted it to be. When the ANC went into exile in 1960, and when they came back into the country 30 years later in 1990, South Africa was a different place, and the world was a different place. So the enabling environment to implement policies that they espoused from the 1960s to 1990, it was simply not going to work. And the ANC, as I argue in the book, was completely ill-prepared to try and implement what they wanted, not only what they wanted to, but to try and influence events between 1990 and 94. Of course, they were completely focused on obtaining political power because the struggle against apartheid was about overthrowing a political system. But part of that political system was an economic system which in this country was characterized by a form of apartheid capitalism, a capitalist society, but which operated in a closed environment. Companies like Anglo-American, the big conglomerates, Rembrandt, Anglo-Val, Sanlam, etc., they were unable to take their money out of the country, for example, due to exchange rate controls. So they weren't unable to take out capital to invest elsewhere. So you saw the rise of enormous conglomerates in the country. There's a famous anecdote in Michael Cardo's book about Harry Oppenheimer that was just released now, where he writes that at one stage in South Africa, you woke up in the morning in a house built by an Anglo-American construction company. You heated your toast in a toaster that was built by a company owned by Anglo-American. You climbed into your car, assembled by an Anglo-American plant, and you went to your Anglo-American job. So companies,
they had this economic monopoly.
Companies like Anglo-American was completely dominant in the South African environment. And when the ANC returned in 1990, companies like Anglo again, alongside Anton Rupert's, Rembrandt, Anglo-Val, etc., were concerned about what was coming down the pipeline if the ANC was going to implement what they said they wanted to implement.
Was that about nationalization?
Absolutely. So the ANC, when they returned in 1990, did not have fully fledged or fully developed economic policies. They did not return, in the words of Trevor Manuel, who I interviewed extensively for the book, with filing cabinets full of ideas of how to transform the South African economy. They did know that they wanted political power, though, but economic power, not so much. And that paved the way for companies like Oppenheimer's Anglo and Rupert's Rembrandt to try and influence the transition, to try and influence what a future democratic South Africa might look like. And obviously what they did was a large measure was born out of self-interest, because they were still making a hell of a lot of profit for their shareholders, and they wanted to continue to making these massive profits. But they will only be able to do so if the democratic South Africa, the post-apartheid South Africa, was built on a free market economy. And that's where the influence of big capital started coming through very strongly between, I'd say, 1985 and 1994. And that's where the grey area between politics and money, politics and capital, really started expanding. And you know, what we've seen since then, and Jacques wrote about it extensively as well, is the grey area where money flows into politics, where it influences politics, where it influences politicians, where you've got private business vying for access to state resources, and that's where corruption happens. So corruption has always been with us since the 1980s, 70s, 60s, 50s. But in a democratic South Africa, the nexus, the crossing point between capital and politics, it's a massive grey area. And we see where money flows from private capital to politicians. We've seen how state resources over the last decade or more have been extracted from big companies. We write about Eskom every single day. We write about parastatals, where private companies want to extract resources, and those relationships started back then.
You write quite a lot about the SOEs as well, and Eskom would fall under those SOEs. There's PRASA as well, and the others, and how they have been decimated to a point that everyone has lost hope in them, and there's no way to resuscitate them.
Yeah, it's going to be, I don't know whether it's on, but anyway, it's going to be very difficult to resuscitate them with the present government. I mean, if you look at our ministers, I mean, they are a hopeless bunch. But you see, what happened is when Jacob Zuma came to power in May 2009, because he inherited a very healthy economy and there was a lot of money available. He announced these massive capital projects for PRASA, for Transnet. Shortly after that, they started with Kusile and Medupi. Massive capital projects. In the end, they were looted. I mean, if you think about Transnet, Transnet can't deliver coal efficiently anymore to the Richards Bay Harbour. There's very little left of PRASA. All that money is gone. You know, there was a figure at the Truth Commission which was worked out by accountants and whatever, and they said that just the Guptas, and remember there were many other looters as well, just the Guptas extracted 49 billion rand from the South African economy. We got no value for money. PRASA got some of their locomotives, but they were too tall for the South African rails, and they're still standing in a depot somewhere. Transnet got some of its locomotives from the Chinese. I mean, they can't get spare parts for them. We all know with Medupi and Kusile that they about tripled, that the cost of building them just about tripled, and it would take another 3 years for Medupi to be completed. So there were these massive capital projects that were announced. The South African taxpayer gave billions and billions and billions that were looted. Now we're sitting in a situation where there's no more money. We don't have the money to resuscitate these organizations. And you know, there's no indication that the economy is soon going to recover, that we're going to have, you know, a flurry of new jobs or anything like that. And that's why I'm saying if we continue, you know, as a journalist, you're supposed to be neutral and independent and whatever. But we have to, when something is so wrong, we have to say it. And we cannot continue with the present government. They will run this country into the ground. They have already to a certain extent. You know, and people always ask me, you know, what can I do? What can I do as an individual? I mean, you all have a vote. And we're going to vote next year. And, you know, everybody will have to make a choice. So South Africans need to do something. And a lot is being done behind the scenes by the private sector, by civil society. But, you know, we're going to vote next year, and as they say in Afrikaans, stem vroeg en stem reg.
May I add, Bulelwa, just to what Jacques saying, two things. One, I completely agree with Jacques, and we've said this in the past, but there's simply no way. And journalists, Jacques right, you know, we need to remain, you know, it's objectivity is a rumor in journalism. We all come with our own way of socialization and frame of reference and all the rest of it. But there's simply no way as a journalist you know, as journalists, we try to use the Constitution as our point of departure and the press code. You know, those are the two documents that we use as our lodestars. And if we are honest with ourselves as journalists, you know, there's simply no way that we can tell the South African public next year ahead of the election that this election is purely about different policy platforms between parties, because it's not. The ANC is an organization that is absolutely hell-bent on destroying whatever is in front of it, and we simply cannot skirt away from that anymore. Every name, give me in the name of any institution that you can think of, and it's been absolutely run into the ground over the last decade or more, either by incompetence or by criminality, and sometimes in equal measure. And don't forget, ineptness. There's an absolute ineptitude at various levels of government that we simply cannot get away from anymore. And it's not, the middle class can kind of insulate itself against many of the failings of government. Many of the people in this room have the ability to, for example, install solar panels at their homes, or whatever the case may be, to try and make their lives easier. But it's the majority of South Africans who are poor and who are black who are suffering under this government, and that's simply a matter of fact. The Zondo report, 5,500 pages of the Zondo report. It sits in my study at home. It's been completely, sorry. The Zondo report has been completely forgotten. I mean, if you just cursorily glance through the Zondo report, it's an absolute indictment of this government. And they should have no moral authority to govern after next year. But of course, our political dynamics would make it that, Jacques, we can speculate about 50 or 51%, but, the ANC will still come in very strong next year. But I think, there's a strong argument to be made out that the ANC are anti-constitutionalist and anti-democratic, and that they simply cannot govern next year after the election. The second thing I want to add after what Jacques said is he spoke about the SOEs that were sites of extraction. Now, the SOEs were the big Eskom, Prasa, Transnet, all of the SOEs that Jacques mentioned. Billions of rands of resources were extracted from those institutions. But they are now, there's nothing left to steal in those institutions. So they're moving to the next layer. And what we're seeing, Jacques is an expert on organized crime, but we're seeing these organized crime networks being entrenched at municipal level, metro municipal level. That's the next big level of extraction. And what we're seeing in Gauteng, Tshwane, Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela Bay, the big metros, eThekwini. I mean, KZN is a whole project on itself, Jacques. I mean, the levels of corruption and extraction at municipal level there is mind-boggling. And a lot of that money comes back to the party because they need to finance their elections. They can't do it from money that they fleece from Eskom or Transnet or Prasa anymore. Now they're doing it through the municipalities. So that's why we're seeing these revolving doors of metropolitan mayors in Johannesburg, Tshwane, and elsewhere, because they want to retain access to these networks of extraction. And let me tell you, they are big, they are scary, and the individuals involved aren't afraid to kill. And for the first time, and Jacques and I, we've spoke about it before, we're starting to feel it a little bit closer to ourselves now, where they are prepared to kill. And the murder of Babita Deokaran, a whistleblower in Gauteng, is the perfect example. She was killed because she exposed extraction, rent-seeking, and corruption linked to one hospital in Gauteng, Tembisa, where billions were stolen, and she was murdered. Now, there are many instances like that in Gauteng, I can tell you. These networks of extraction, these organized corruption, organized crime networks are very deeply entrenched, and more often than not, they're linked to the governing party.
We might not have, as a country, money anymore to plow back into the economy to create jobs for others. But there are a few individuals who are in political positions or who have close ties to the political elite, who still have money for their own families, for their own. And you talk about those people who have risen into a billionaires club. Just define for me what a billionaire is. Is it in terms of net worth, or how does it work, especially for these four faces that I'm looking at? Tokyo Sohwale, Saki Maxozoma. I remember Saki Maxozoma was with the South African Council of Churches at some point during the struggle. And then you have Patrice Motsepe, and then we have CR.
Yeah, Bulelwa, so we have to acknowledge that in 1994, with the transition to democracy, which was 29 years ago yesterday, the country, the shape of the country's economy was different. The shape of society was different, and I argue in the book that big business, big capital wanted to remain in the country, but in order for them to remain in the country, as I said earlier, they had to ensure that the country is built broadly along the principles of a free market. But if they wanted to do that, they needed a stable society, and the transition from apartheid to democracy, it necessitated a stable middle class. It necessitated a stable society, and the only way in which that could happen on the long term, the only way in which they could ensure, or South Africans could ensure, a stable society was by creating a well-resourced and an emerging and a new black middle class, which was very small in 1994. So big capital really tried to broaden access to their resources and give that access to black people, emerging members of the black middle class. That was obviously done out of self-interest, but many people like Mike Spicer from Anglo-American were really driven by a sense of fairness and a sense of redress based on 300 years of oppression, colonialism and apartheid. So what they also did was cherry-pick some winners, because they also realized that, for Anglo-American to retain a form of credibility in a post-apartheid South Africa, they needed black faces on their board. So that's why they co-opted people like Cyril Ramaphosa, who really is not a good businessman. When he became president, everyone said, thank heavens for Cyril because he understands business. No, he's not a businessman. He was given billions of rands for free in a series of vendor finance.
Well, at least he can count. Zuma couldn't count.
That's, count our blessings, Jacques. Very, very low bar. But Cyril was given free money by Anglo-American, became chairperson of various boards. And he's rich today, not because he's a fantastic businessman. He's rich today, fabulously wealthy today, not because he built something from scratch or turned around a struggling enterprise. He's filthy rich today because Anglo-American and the Oppenheimer said, let's pull Cyril out. He's the Secretary General of the ANC. Thabo Mbeki doesn't want him post Mandela. He's tired of politics. He's wounded as well. So let's give him a leg up and help him with some BE deals. And that's what happened to a number of them. What I found interesting, though, is that someone like Patrice Motsepe, he's someone that actually built something from scratch. He started his business from the back of his car. He worked for a law firm in Johannesburg in the mining section, came into contact with mining corporations there, started a general cleaning services company from the back of his car where he provided general cleaning services to mines, went to Bobby Gottsel at Anglo-American, said, look, give me some of your old shafts and I'll try to make them profitable again. And there's a wonderful anecdote where a young Patrice Motsepe met Harry Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer said, boy, where do you think you will succeed where Anglo has not? And he succeeded, and he became very, very wealthy, very close to the Sanlam crowd in Bellville, just up the road here, and became rich because he built something from scratch. So just like Afrikaner capitalism was a project from Afrikaner business, or Afrikaner governments rather, this was a project of an African nationalist government as well.
I just want to add one thing. We say there's no money. But yet here comes the international community, and they prepare to give us $9.5 billion. That's 150 billion rand for a transition to renewable energy. Yet now we sit with Gwedi Mantashe and Pravin Gordhan, and we've got an electricity minister who doesn't really have a job. And yet we are not taking that opportunity and running with it. Pravin Gordhan, he was a hero during state capture because he held on to the treasury. Now not so much anymore because I think there's a bit of a hangover from his communist days. I think he's a socialist. So there is this idea in government, in the ANC, in the ruling party, that government has to provide everything. They cannot get their heads I mean, I think Ramaphosa did, but they don't seem to be able to get their heads around breaking Eskom into 3 business units, make it profitable, take that $9.5 billion and, create renewable energy, maybe, because it's going to be more difficult to steal from Eskom. At the moment, Eskom does something like, I saw the figure the other day, something like 90 billion rand of procurement every year. I mean, that's a massive amount of money. So if you can sort of get 5 billion from that, nobody's really going to know about it. So we even have that where there isn't money available, there isn't money available for government, but money is made available by the international community, and we don't seem to want it.
Okay. Before I open the discussion to the floor, you've spoken about the fact that there's we need an alternative to the present government if we really want change in South Africa. But just removing one party and replacing it with another might be a bit of a problem. How do we go about it?
Look, Jacques gave the answer to the public earlier. I mean, people need to go and vote. I remember distinctly, was it Jacques 10, 15, 20 years, 30 years ago, where people said, look, my vote's not going to make a difference. The ANC, I mean, in 2004, I think their support after that general election was something like 69.69%. They're sitting on 57% now. During the last municipal election, they went under 50% for the first time. If you look at the election numbers, the previous election, 38 million South Africans were eligible to vote. Of that 38 million, only 27 million registered to vote. Of that 27 million, less than 16 actually went to vote. Of that 16 million people who voted, less than 9 voted for the ANC. So you can see that we're actually being run by a minority government at the moment. So there's an enormous electoral market out there of voters who have simply lost faith in the political system, who simply don't want to go and vote. So there's an enormous opportunity for political parties to go out there and go and find voters, to go and find voters and win voters over. So that's their biggest challenge, is to provide an alternative to the voting public. At the moment, in Johannesburg, where I live, voters have told all the parties, we don't trust anyone. So that we've got a revolving door of metropolitan mayors in Johannesburg and Pretoria because there's no party that has a majority, and we still have not figured out how to work with a coalition. Coalitions are the future. Oh, wow. That's the only way that we're going to be able to do this. And I think it's if opposition parties can find a way of putting aside their most significant differences and find a way of working together in service of the greater good, I think we're on a good wicket. The ANC has never been as weak before. They don't have money, they don't have organization, they don't have leadership. I mean, Fikile Mbalulu is the Secretary General of the ANC, and that's the biggest boon for the opposition because he's just going to destroy the party like he did with the Department of Transport that he's done over the last couple of years. So that's a good thing for the opposition, so they need to exploit it. Whether they can is a different question, but they've got time to do it, but they need to get their act together.
Pieter, do you think there's an opportunity for Julius Malema to become very powerful here? If we have a coalition government between the ANC and the EFF, and they seem to be willing to work together, what's the chances of Malema becoming the deputy president or whatever?
Jacques, it's not impossible. I think that's one of the most pressing scenarios that people are working with, is a scenario where you've got Paul Mashatile perhaps as president and Julius Malema as his deputy. Because if the ANC goes under 50, the first place they'll look at as a coalition partner is the EFF. There's a strong grouping in the ANC revolving around Panyaza Lesufi, the ANC's leader in Gauteng, that are very close to Julius Malema and working very hard to pull the EFF into all sorts of coalitions in KZN and Gauteng. Mashatile is part of a grouping that wants to get rid of Cyril as soon as they can, and Cyril is weak. I mean, he's a weak leader. He doesn't want to lay down the law in his own party, never mind cabinet, So a scenario where Mashatile becomes president, and Malema as deputy president is not beyond the realms of possibility. Because if the EFF lends their support to the ANC after next year's election, Julius is going to drive a hard bargain. I can promise you, he's not going to fall for Minister of Arts and Culture. Deputy President, Minister of Finance, Minister of Public Works, Enterprises, where all the money, the big money accounts are. That's where they'll go. So it's a definite possibility.
Let's also hear from the members of the public. I see Major General Jeremy Vieri.
I think my question is directed at Pieter. Pieter, in the course of research for your book, because I notice you have Toke Sehwale as one of the figures, have you been exposed to the development of alternative economic models and the thinking and the role that Robben Island played in the mid-80s, especially after the Harare Declaration? I ask you this question because I was there as part of those groups. And I can tell you, there were detailed debates that sometimes bordered on factionalism around market socialism in the theories of Leszek Kolakowski and around monetarism in Friedman's type of monetarism, which people like Tokyo articulated very, very effectively. There was actually, the big question was, how do we build a black capitalist class without seeding capital? And the irony is, in all the models we studied, one of the key books I remember was one of the things was False Capitalism, I think, at the time. We went to go study the history of Volksgasbeck, of every single company. We studied the history of OK Bazaars and all of these companies at a very micro level and the policies that underpin that. And we developed alternative models. There are some of them that came out of there with very clear models of the mixed economy. And it wasn't developed in exile, I can tell you that, because we were asked to do it on the island. So we would send things through. So I think sometimes, the presumption is a bit questionable, especially with an example like Tokyo, because I know how articulate he was about the building of a black capitalist class and where he got the seeding capital from, because he got it from our funds in Robben Island.
Jeremy,
that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Is it not a case where in the transitions within the ANC leadership-wise, we had a decline of that type of thinking that was prevalent there? I can think of Kgalema Motlanthe, for example, who was a very keen political. Yeah. Mziku Malo, for example, in industry. These figures were people who were thinkers. I was not on there agreeing with them at the time, but at least we were also thinking alternatively in terms of the Chinese model, for example, the market socialist model, as some Polish political economists saw it.
Thanks for the question, Jeremy. Great question. Yes, I'm right about that. What was very clear to me in the research that I did was that a lot of research happened locally inside of the country, on the island, and in Cape Town specifically, around the UDM, or the UDF rather, and COSATU specifically after 1985 to develop alternative economic models. And that there was a lot of research being done by individuals, like you mentioned, involved on the island, various think tanks related to the UDF, COSATU, the University of the Western Cape, that came up with alternative economic models. There was work done in London by the group that later became MERG, the Macroeconomic Research Group. So a lot of work was done by the broader liberation movement. But once the ANC was released, Trevor Manuel told me that there was enormous antagonism towards research and groupings from inside the country, that the exiles led by Thabo Mbeki felt very strongly that economic policy will be decided by the ANC once they've taken power. So a lot of the work that was done in the 1980s and the early 1990s by groupings such as yourselves, MERG, etc., was simply swept off the table once the ANC's economic desk was established in Johannesburg. In fact, Jay Naidoo told me, thinking back, why did the ANC not go to establish black business, for example, around the taxi industry, the small and micro businesses that were operating in and around townships in Johannesburg, to try and build up industrialists from there. So the question remains, was the ANC co-opted by big capital? And that's the question that I try to answer in the book. And there's still a hell of a lot of work I think that needs to be done. Trevor Manuel was adamant that the work that was done by Merg and some of those other groups were not adequate. Obviously, critics of Manuel and Mboweni and Mbeki say that they were co-opted by the IMF and the World Bank in the build-up to 1994. So it's still very much a contentious issue. And I remember when I interviewed Trevor Manuel, who you know very well know, I suppose. You know, he got very, very aggressive when I asked him about Merg, saying, you know, why were the Merg proposals not accepted, for example? You know, but I think that process was very strongly driven by Thabo Mbeki, and you know as well as I do, you know, when Thabo Mbeki gets something into his head, it's very difficult to shift him. But thank you for the question.
Any other questions? Okay. We'll start with this gentleman in the black jacket.
I'm just going to jump in quickly. Yeah,
All right.
sorry,
okay.
ma'am. To a certain extent, you've answered a question earlier, or in your last response now. There's an old saying, it says, in chaos, people become filthy rich. And we've experienced it now through the COVID period. Within that 2 years, the amount of billionaires that globally became billionaires because of COVID. And I think here in South Africa, my observation was, through the Zondo Commission, he touched on it and says, oh, the question was asked, where's the corporates in all these multi-million-dollar deals, the Prasas, the Escoms? Where's the corporates? Nobody talks about the corporates. If you look at, if I take my simple analogy, is that we're sitting with middle-class, grade 10 officials in the State Department. The guys that says who's responsible to sign off billion-dollar deals or billion-rand deals, but they don't have the qualifications. And sometimes you ask the question, how did these guys come up with these plans or these deals? Surely in some sort of this, the lawyers, these national, international lawyers were part of it, or business people. So the question I'm always asking, where's the corporate in this whole thing? Yes, we're sitting with these middle-class politicians that's now running the shots here. Thank you.
Well, you know, I don't think there's much of a difference between the corporate world and a greedy politician. I mean, they all the same. It's about money. And lots of evidence, and you know, we've written about this, is that, you know, when we talk about state capture, we all say Gupta, Gupta, Gupta. There were big corporations involved. For example, ABB was a big international corporation, has already paid back 6 billion rand to Eskom for overcharging them for the construction of Medupi and Kusile. They were all involved. I mean, they were massive corporations involved in state capture. The investigation that the SIU is doing at the moment, and they're busy looking at the construction of Kusile and Medupi. You know, Hitachi, General Electric, Stefanuti Stocks. I mean, big corporations were involved in fraud and corruption. So when you talk about greed goes across color, it goes across, you know, sort of individuals, corporations, it includes everyone. And I think it was a big shortcoming of the State Capture Commission that they didn't pay enough attention to the role of big corporations in state capture. You know, and I don't think it's going to change. I mean, these people, they have to be checked, they have to be properly audited. And it's true what you're saying is that sometimes you look at decisions that are being made in the top echelons of the state-owned enterprises and whatever, and you think, how the hell did that person get that job? If you look, for example, if you look at some of the corruption at Eskom, it was just blatant, absolutely blatant. You know, you're sitting with municipalities that do procurement. Every municipality has got a tender committee. And you talk about big, big money. And you know, you look at how did they make that decision? Who actually approved it? And sometimes it's blatant. The corruption is absolutely blatant, but people are also very brazen. They're not that scared of the hawks or the police anymore. And I think that plays a big role. You know, when law enforcement is on its knees, organized crime is going to flourish because there's very little consequences for the culprits.
I just want to add one anecdote to what Jacques said now. It's as part of our reporting into Eskom, we came across these emails between a guy who was the head of Group executive for Group Capital at Eskom. Now these guys can't manage their own finances. So what he used to do was he's on senior management level at Eskom. So what he used to do was ahead of a weekend when he didn't have money, he'd email the boss of one of the country's big five construction companies, WBHO, who was helping with the construction at Kusile, said, I need 350 for the weekend. And then before 4 o'clock, they paid in 350,000 rands cash into his Autobank denim card or whatever it was. That's how brazen it was. And it's not even done through a Gmail address. It's, from your corporate address, and look, I need this. And, then they pay that money because they want the contract to continue building Kusile. So the brazenness of the corruption is something that is absolutely flabbergasting.
Absolutely. In the case of Prasa, for example, one of the big looters of Prasa built himself a house of 60 million rand in the Waterfall estate in Johannesburg. And he informed the Spanish company that was supposed to provide the locomotives for Prasa. He informed them that his wife loves Italian kitchens. She got an Italian kitchen in the Waterfall estate. And sometimes it was as blatant as that. And by the way, I mean, this guy's never been arrested. The docker disappeared. He's living, and it was blatant corruption.
Jacques, I'd like to ask you, in the light of your recent investigation into the, should I call it a project that the Reiter initiated to investigate corruption at Eskom, the fact that it seems to be problematic. I mean, you indicated that an individual like Tony Kutsia, I think, was involved. Westhuizen, and etc. from George Fiver's, from his company. Have you, in the process of investigating this, do you have new insights into the nature of the corruption at Eskom? Because you, for instance, it came out that the people that were implied by the Reiter, like ministers, seem to not have been involved, etc. And various other, statements and allegations that were made by the Reiter seem to have been, discredited. Any insights, new insights? Is it not as bad as we thought, or?
The stories we did at News 24, we're not saying for a moment that there's not fraud and corruption in Eskom. Fraud and corruption in Eskom is massive, and it's destroying the utility. And I mean, News 24 has done a long investigation, what the Eskom files about fraud and corruption. All we said is that, here's a private company that was paid 50 million rand by the private sector, and that they basically conned the Reiter and Oberholzer and business leadership South Africa that gave 18 million rand for the investigation. And that is basically, you can't just implicate people without any evidence. Now, we might not like Wedi Mantashe and David Mabuza, and it's clear where I come from. But you can't just implicate them in attempted murder and the looting of Eskom if you don't have anything substantial. And that was the problem here, is that George Fiver's Forensic and Risk, the name of the company, came along. They got massive money from the private sector, and they produced absolute nonsense, which is not worth the paper it's written on. And it's counterproductive because you're not getting then to the real culprits. You throw Montage and Mabuza out there, but you don't get to the real people behind the fraud and corruption. And I have empathy for the writer, that he went to the private sector because he was so frustrated that law enforcement was doing nothing. So he thought, let me get a private firm sponsored by the private sector, and let's unearth the fraud and corruption at Eskom. But I think he was conned. Jan Oberholzer was conned. Business leadership South Africa was conned. They didn't get any value for their money. The problem was that the writer took that information, and it's nothing more than information. He took that information, and in his famous interview with ENCA in February, that was the basis of his interview. Was about the hit squad in Mpumalanga and the 4 big criminal cartels. I'm not saying there's no criminal cartels. Of course there are. There's massive organized crime in Eskom. But we have a duty to expose something which is so obviously wrong. And I think the writer was very naive. I think he had good intentions, but he was very naive and he was conned. This was a money-making exercise. Nothing more than that.
I'll take one more last question because we have run out of time now.
Just 2 remarks about Jacques and Pieter's request or demand that they should be punished, the government should be punished at the voting stations next year, and the importance of that for the future of the South Africa. I like the journalists, there must be a national drive. I know Steenhuisen is talking about a national drive to get the young people who is benefiting from the NUFSAS bursaries in a very funny way, to get them to influence other young people in South Africa about the election next year. So the only people that can do that are the investigative journalists and the media in South Africa. So I want to plead with you 2 gentlemen to influence all the other brilliant journalists to start a national drive to see that they don't get the 50% that they want. The second remark I want to make is about the think tank University of Robben Island and their ethic department for leadership, and the University of Stellenbosch ethic department of leadership. Seems like both those departments failed at both those universities.
Thank you. You make me think. I got a WhatsApp yesterday, and I don't know where this gentleman got my number from, but I got a WhatsApp message yesterday from somebody living in Heidelberg, in Gauteng, who said, "I've been without water now for 6 days. Please help me." And I WhatsApped him, and I said to him, "I'm very sorry about your position. Who's your counselor, whatever." But yeah, I mean, we can take things up to a point and no further.
I think what's clear and what's coming out of both books is that Zuma was not the only problem that we have in this country. We've got so many other problems that we have to tackle together as the nations. But when I was reading these books, I think I went through so many emotions. I went from despair, anxiety, and then when I see civil society rising up again, like the recent launch of Rise Mzansi, and all those debates that are going on about the future of this country, and they will no longer tolerate to be on the sidelines, but be involved to shape our future. I get hope. And I hope that you will get that hope from reading these books as well. They are available there, and while these 2 gentlemen are still here, I'm sure they won't mind signing your copy. But thank you so much for your engagements in this debate and for taking an interest, really, in our country. And I thank you all. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you so much.